subcommittee to order. We're going to start out today with the Division of Post Audit, and we'll ask Amy Deckard to begin a budget overview for the Division of Post Audit. Amy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You should have the draft budget analysis for the Legislative Division of Post Audit, or it is available on the subcommittee's page on the Legislature's website. So the Legislative Division of Post Audit is the audit arm of the Kansas Legislature and is responsible for performance audits of state agencies and programs, IT security audits, and evaluations of the state's economic development incentives. If I could turn your attention to page 6 of the draft, talk about the current year, fiscal year 2021. The 2020 legislature approved a state general fund budget of slightly under $3.1 million for the Legislative Division of Post Audit. There was an increase of $261,500 based on a reappropriation of fiscal year 2020 funding that was not spent in 2020 and was shifted into 2021. That increases the approved amount from the State General Fund to $3.4 million from the State General Fund. The agency requested an estimated revised expenditures for 2021 of $3.3 million, all State General Fund, which is a decrease of $24,889 or 0.7% below that approved amount. Might note that the expenditures for 2021 do include a $150,000 contingency for hiring outside contractors for those economic development tax incentives evaluations. And the governor did concur with the agency's revised 2021 estimate. Be happy to answer any questions or move on to 2022.
Great, thank you, Amy. We'll go ahead and have you do 21 and 22 on each budget, and then we will do questions at the end of both.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fiscal year 2022 for the Legislative Division of Post Audit is on page 7. The agency has requested $3.4 million, all from the State General Fund. For fiscal year 2022, this is $20,297 or 0.6% above the revised fiscal year 2021 estimate. This does include contracts for the assistance of selected performance audits and evaluations of those economic development tax incentives. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2022 requests for the Legislative Division of Post Audit.
Thank you, Amy. Any questions on 21 or 22 for the Division of Post Audit Committee? Seeing none, we'll hold action on this until we have the full committee, and we'll move on next, Amy, to the Legislative Coordinating Council, if you'd like to give us that budget.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You should have a draft for the Legislative Coordinating Council in front of you. Just a reminder that the budget for the LCC does include the compensation and expenses associated with the LCC meetings, as well as the salaries and wages for the Division of Legislative Administrative Services. If I could turn your attention to page 6, fiscal year 2021, the current year. The 2020 legislature approved a State General Fund budget of $745,222 for the LCC for fiscal year 2021. There was an increase of almost $25 million based on reappropriation of fiscal year 2020 funding that was not spent in 2020 and was shifted into 2021. There was also a transfer of $6 million, including $5 million to the Department of Commerce and $1 million to the State Fair for COVID-19 relief. You'll remember that the budget bill for 2020 included a $50 million appropriation to the LCC's budget for coronavirus response. And so then the portion that was not expended did roll forward into 2021. The agency estimate for 2021 was $19.7 million, all from the State General Fund, which was the same as the approved amount. This did include the $19 million in remaining coronavirus relief monies that had reappropriated. The governor recommends expenditures totaling $3.1 million from State General Fund. This is a reduction of $16.7 million or 84.5% below the revised estimate. It does include a lapse of those $16.7 million in remaining coronavirus response accounts from the state general fund. For fiscal year 22, for the Legislative Coordinating Council on page 7, the agency has requested $757,225, all from the state general fund, which is a decrease of $19 million below the revised estimate. Again, that's the lack of the reappropriated funds from the coronavirus response account. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2022 request.
Thank you, Amy. Questions, committee, for Amy on 21 or 22 for the LCC? Senator Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Amy, and I'm catching up, the $5 million that was transferred out to Commerce, the $1 million to the State Fair, it's COVID relief. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. The budget bill appropriated $50 million to the LCC for coronavirus response. So those were directed to have the Legislative Budget Committee review those and then make recommendations to the LCC. So there was a portion of those funds that were transferred out in fiscal year 2020. The remainder reappropriated into 2021. So the Legislative Budget Committee and the LCC approved recommendations to pay additional $5 million to the Department of Commerce for its economic incentives program for the Job Creation Program Fund. So that was a total of $10.5 million between the 2 years. And the State Fair received $1 million in fiscal year 2021 after they had received $205,000 in 2020.
Amy, are you still going?
I was just going to note, Mr. Chairman, that there are 2 pending recommendations from the Legislative Budget Committee for the LCC, which would be an additional $1.3 million for the State Fair and $1 million for KDHE for the local health departments.
And that leads to my question, which was going to be, if there are outstanding requests and we were to approve this, would the dollars be there then for those requests, or are those pulled out if we go with what's the governor's recommendation?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, the governor's recommendation to lapse the funding would be what's remaining, assuming those are approved. So there is funding to account for those 2 if the LCC decides to approve those recommendations.
Thank you, Amy. Any other questions, committee, on the LCC budget? Seeing none, we'll also hold and give the minority party's senator the largest amount of time possible to get to his committee meeting while we hear from Amy on the Legislative Research Department budget. And then we'll have, if you guys don't mind sticking around, we'll do our best to accommodate the senator. Amy, if you would go ahead and move to the Legislative Research Department.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Legislative Research Department does provide research and fiscal analysis for the legislature. If you turn to page 6 of the draft budget analysis for the Legislative Research Department, the 2020 legislature did approve a state general fund budget of $4.38 million for the research department. There was an increase of $387,000 based on reappropriation of fiscal year 2020 funding that was not spent in 2020 and was shifted into 2021. That did change the approved state general fund amount to $4.8 million. The agency is requesting a revised budget of $4.6 million, all from the state general fund, which is a decrease of $167,000 or 3.5% below the approved amount. Might note that this does include an increase necessary for the constitutional requirement to redraw districts. This would include 3 temporary staff as well as equipment and supplies. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2021 revised estimate. Turning to fiscal year 2022 on page 7, The agency has requested $4.5 million, all from the State General Fund, which is $53,271, or 1.2% below the revised 2021 estimate. This does continue that funding for the redistricting process, however, at a lower rate than in fiscal year 2021. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2022 request.
Thank you, Amy. Questions, committee, on 21 and 22 for the Legislative Research Department? Give everyone a moment to look it over. Questions, committee? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and move to the Legislature. Amy, if you would begin on that.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. So the Legislature, you should have the draft analysis in front of you. Just might remind you that the budget for the Legislature finances the operations of the House and Senate, joint expenses, legislative claims, special maintenance and repair expenses, as well as the Legislative Branch Information System, or ks, as well as the retirement program for session-only employees. So turning to page 6 for fiscal year 2021. The 2020 Legislature approved a State General Fund budget of $20.9 million for the Legislature for fiscal year 2021. There has been an increase of $6 million based on reappropriation of fiscal year 2020 funding that was not spent and has been shifted into 2021. The agency estimates a revised budget of $26.9 million, all State General Fund for fiscal year 2021, which is the same as the approved amount. Might note that the amount budgeted for operating expenses is $4.2 million more than last year's submission. Major adjustments include expenditure increases for information systems consulting, including work for the virtual State House project, computer software and equipment, stationery for new legislators, as well as annual maintenance costs for the virtual State House project, increased travel expenses, temporary staff, and cleaning supplies. I might note that there was 2 additional FTE positions, that the funding was included. However, the actual FTEs were inadvertently omitted in this request. The governor's recommendation for fiscal year 2021 is at the top of page 7. The governor recommends $32 million, including $26.9 million State General Fund. This is an increase of $5.1 million, or 18.8%, all from federal funds above the agency's revised estimate. This is attributable for funds awarded by the SPARK Task Force and approved by the State Finance Council from the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund for the Virtual State House project. Also on page 7, you see fiscal year 2022, the budget year. The agency's requested $23.7 million, all from the State General Fund, which is $3.2 million, or 11.8% less than the 2021 revised estimate. The majority of these reductions reflect one-time expenditures in 2021 that do not reoccur in 2022. These reductions are partially offset by increased expenditures necessary to redraw and redistrict the House, Senate, and State Board of Education, as well as the congressional districts. The request does include the addition of 2 FTE positions, 4K Lois associated with the Virtual State House project, as well as annual maintenance costs associated with that project. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 22 request.
Thank you, Amy. Any questions, committee, on the legislature's budget for 21 and 22? Seeing none, we will continue to hold for our esteemed appointee from the minority party. He has been reached out to by staff, so we'll see if we can't get him in here before we start voting. We'll move on now, Amy, to the reviser of statutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You should have a draft budget analysis in front of you for the reviser of statutes. I just might note that they do provide drafting of bills, resolutions, and committee reports, as well as responsibility for continuous statutory revisions for the general session laws of Kansas and the into the Kansas statutes annotated. If I could turn your attention to page 6 for fiscal year 2021. The 2020 legislature approved a state general fund budget of $4.1 million for the reviser of statutes. There has been an increase of $487,000 based on reappropriation of fiscal year 2020 funding that was not spent in 2020 and has shifted into fiscal year 2022. That adjusts the approved amount to $4.6 million. The agency has requested a revised fiscal year 2021 budget of $4.2 million, all from the state general fund, which is a decrease of $384,000 or 8.1% below the approved amount. The decrease is due to the decision in 2020 not to publish selected hardbound volumes of the Kansas statutes annotated, which had been included in that approved amount for 2020. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2021 revised estimate. For fiscal year 22, on page 7, the agency has requested expenditures of $4.2 million, all from the state general fund. This is an increase of $16,000 or 0.4% above the fiscal year 2021 revised estimate. Included in these requested funds is funding for the publication of volumes 3, 3A, and 3B of the Kansas statutes annotated. The governor does concur with the agency's fiscal year 2022 request.
Thank you, Amy. Questions, committee, on the Office of the Reviser of Statutes budget for 21 and 22? Seeing none. Looks like we found a senator. All right, Justin, would you like to talk about your budget now that we're all here? Thank you, Senator Hawk, for joining us. Here's fine. Yep, here you go. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I don't have any specific remarks. I think Amy highlighted our budget pretty simply this year. Always the two things that I keep in front of other members of the legislature is, of course, we go through some additional layers of scrutiny because I report directly to the Post Audit Committee, which makes sense. So the executive subcommittee of the Post Audit Committee and the full committee have reviewed our budget and passed it to the LCC, who's passed it to you. We are within our appropriated amounts, so I don't need any more money. In fact, I'll be able to give a little bit back, and that includes the moratorium on the death and disability, like the other agencies. So that's included in the money that I'm returning, is that portion that's been allotted for that. My out-year request, 22, is almost identical to my previous request. We have an increase in rent costs, but also a subsequent decrease in how much we put in our contingency fund, so that about evens out. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any specific questions the committee may have. It's your pleasure.
Great, thank you, Justin. Any questions, committee, on Division of Post Audit? Seeing none, thank you for appearing here today, Justin. Do we have any questions on the LCC or the legislature? Did you want to present or just stand for questions? Okay, great. Any questions? Senator Hawk.
Just one of my questions, forgive me, I got another meeting coming up. With all the pandemic and the things we've done with the technology, has that put a strain on your budget, particularly?
Mr. Chairman, if I might. Senator Hawk, it has not put a strain on our budget because the legislature received $5.068 million in CARES Act funding, which is taking care of the hardware, software of all the technology increases that you see in the rooms. And so, no, it has not impacted our budget as long as the legislature's budget stays intact the way that it is. We're good. And if I might move to the LCC's budget, you see also the reduction of $16.9 million or whatever the exact amount was. That amount was the $50 million in that was appropriated to the LCC for CARES Act relief. And the governor is wanting to lapse 16 million of that and leave 3 million in our budget. The 3.1 million also includes the normal LCC budget of 757,000.
Further questions, committee? Senator Hawk.
Were you excited? Was it sort of like getting a lottery check when you saw that jump of several $1 million? You don't have to answer that. It's exciting to see that, though.
Senator Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tom, so does in the legislative budget with the drawback, we obviously had a short session, things gets reappropriated. Is what's left in the proposed budget contemplate a normal 90-day session with regular costs? Is that's what's contemplated in the balance?
It does contemplate that. That's what we always budget on, is just a regular 90-day session. So in those anomaly years where we go 114 days, there have been at least one of the times of the 114-day session where we had to come back to the legislature in the omnibus bill to ask for more money to finish out the rest of the years. But it's always based on just a normal 90-day session.
There's not a margin for some days for it to potentially go over 3, 4, 5 days. It's based on regular cost 90 days.
Regular cost 90 days, but normally we can handle a 3 or 4 or 5 day extension. We can't handle 27 or 24 days.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further questions, committee? Seeing none, we'll go ahead and work these budgets today. We'll start out with the Division of Post Audit. The chair will entertain a motion regarding the Division of Post Audit budgets for 21 and 22, and for purposes of making that motion, the chair will recognize Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the Legislative Division of Post Audit budget for 21 and 22 as recommended by the governor.
You've heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Hawk. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. We'll move now to the Legislative Coordinating Council. The chair will entertain a motion regarding the Legislative Coordinating Council budget for 21 and 22. For purposes of making the motion, the chair recognizes Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the Legislative Coordinating Council budget for 21 and 22 as recommended by the governor.
You've heard the motion, committee. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Hawk. Any discussion on the motion for the Legislative Coordinating Council budget for FY 21 and 22? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. We'll move next to the Legislative Research Department. Chair will entertain a motion regarding the Legislative Research Department's budget for FY 21 and 22. For purposes of making the motion, the chair recognizes Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the Legislative Research Department budget for 21 and 22 as recommended by the governor.
You've heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Hawk. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Committee, next we will turn to the Legislature budget for FY 21 and 22. The chair will entertain a motion for that budget. For purposes of making the motion, the chair recognizes Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the Legislature budget for 21 and 22 as recommended by the governor.
You've heard the motion. Is there a second? The second is by Senator Hawk. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Finally, we have the Office of the Reviser of Statutes budget for FY 21 and 22. For purposes of making a motion on the budget, the chair recognizes Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move we approve the Office of the Reviser of Statutes budget for 21 and 22 as recommended by the governor.
Heard the motion. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Hawk. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. That is our agenda for today, committee. We are adjourned.